Good evening, guys and ghouls, and welcome to another special supplemental episode of Monster Craze Memoirs, a generational podcast about B-movies. I am your host, Ian Garcia. Sitting on the very tip of the Crimean Peninsula, surrounded by the Black Sea, renowned for its warm climate, picturesque landscapes, and exotic flora, the city of Yalta, a historically significant hub of Mediterranean trade, had been transformed by the late 18th century into one of the premier resort cities for the aristocracy of the Russian Empire. Indeed, Tsar Alexander III, the Emperor of Russia, had personally selected many of his most privileged citizens to colonize the city with the express interest of transforming it into one of the empire's major cultural and intellectual metropoles. Among these privileged citizens was a chemist named Yakov Levitin, who settled with his family in Yalta in 1873. Yakov and his wife had 3 children. His eldest and only son, Volodya, would study to become a lawyer, but eventually turned his attention to journalism, settling in Berlin as a foreign correspondent. His youngest, Adelaide, would study dramatics at the famed Conservatory of Odessa. Upon graduation, Adelaide would change her name to Alla Nazimova, and by her early 20s, she was already on her way to becoming a star in St. Petersburg, scoring title roles in several major productions. In 1904, she would follow her brother in transplanting from Russia to Berlin, only to then move again to London in hopes of advancing her theatrical career internationally. In the fall of 1905, Alla would arrive in New York, establishing herself in the city's Russian colony on 3rd Street, where she appeared in several plays performed for Russian-speaking audiences. Within only half a year, though, Alla, benefiting from her privileged, cultured, and educated background, would already become proficient enough in English to take her rising star to Broadway. Alla would prove to be both a major theatrical celebrity as well as a controversial one. Living independently, evincing no intention of settling down or ever having children, it was an open secret among the who's who of the theatrical world that she maintained multiple partners of both sexes. At a time in which women were expected to be reserved and bashful about their fame, to say nothing of their sex lives and professional ambitions, Alla was unapologetic and unashamed about either her professional or personal life, and made no secret of the fact that she considered the conservative conventions of American society to be beneath her. She would eventually purchase a country estate on King Street in the village of Portchester, dubbing it Hutorok, or in Russian, Little Farm. Yakov Levitin and his wife also had a daughter in between Volodya and Adelaide. Her name was Nina. Like her sister, Nina once had ambitions of becoming a performer, studying piano and voice at the Music Conservatory in Dresden, Germany. Unlike her siblings, however, Nina's career ambitions were cut short by the sudden passing of her father, forcing her to return to Yalta. It was Nina who would ultimately endure the sacrifice of maintaining the Levitin home and estate while her older brother and younger sister prospered in their independent careers. Nina would go on to marry a young military man named Maximilian in 1889. They would have 2 children together, the first a daughter, Lucy Olga, born on June 23, 1900, the second a son, Vladimir Ivan, born on May 7, 1904. According to the memoirs of Nina and Maximilian's first daughter, Lucy Olga, Maximilian was a British Navy officer, whereas other sources claim that he must have been a Russian soldier. In either case, his surname is unknown. Indeed, very little is known about him except that his marriage to Nina was a tempestuous one. Maximilian apparently did not take either his marriage to Nina nor his obligations as a father and retainer of the family's wealth very seriously. He was fond of drinking, gambling, and philandering openly with other women. In no time at all, Maximilian had absconded off or was called back to England, where he died penniless of pneumonia, having gambled away Nina's entire inheritance from her father. With no financial prospects and with growing social and political discontent murmuring in the backdrop of the empire at the turn of the century, Nina made the decision to leave Yalta with her children in 1906. As her older brother and younger sister had done before, she first took the family to Berlin. In stark contrast to her privileged upbringing, she now struggled to support 2 kids as a single mother and clerical worker living in a cheap top-floor apartment. As for her brother Volodya, he apparently tried to help in what way he could, but his financial position was not much better. Having married an impoverished countess named Frida von Schatten, Volodya was living considerably beyond his means, and to make matters worse, he, like Maximilian, seemed to have something of a gambling and alcohol addiction. Hence, Nina made her own way among Berlin's working class for 3 years before finally receiving a letter from Alla offering her a job as a housekeeper at her little farm in Portchester. On the eve of Easter 1909, the Leventon family boarded the SS America out of Bremen on a prepaid second-class ticket to the New World, allowed to avoid standard immigration and customs on Ellis Island through Alla's arrangement and sponsorship. Now adopting the anglicized surname Luton, Lucy Olga and Vladimir, the latter affectionately called Val, would prosper in an upper-crust nouveau riche household commanded by 2 strong, independent women, providing a background for the children balanced between the best cultural and industrious education they could provide. Nina, now also acting as her sister's secretary, companion, and manager of her estate, also found time to learn English and take up fiction writing. One of her short stories was even published in an issue of Harper's Weekly. The young Val was also a storyteller of sorts, inclined to playing imaginative games by himself and prone to flights of fancy in which he would invent long stories just by looking at a painting or photograph, or recite his favorite stories and poems line by line to whoever he could compel to listen. Val's eccentric personality had all the makings of the creative type, but he also had a hard time adjusting to authority. His personal performances often proved a point of consternation and annoyance to Alla and her many socialite friends. At the same time, even at this young age, Val's precociousness towards life seemed to be balanced by a deep introversion and neuroticism. He developed several phobias, including a pathological fear of cats, of the dark, and of being physically touched. As he grew older, Val even seemed to learn to enjoy his own fears, deliberately stimulating them. Highly well-read for his age, he was also quite fond of horror stories, and among the paintings in his Portchester home, he was particularly fond and drawn to the Swiss symbolist Arnold Böcklin's Die Toteninsel, or The Isle of the Dead. Existing in multiple variations that Böcklin painted between 1880 and his death in 1901, The Isle of the Dead depicts a massive rock sitting in the middle of a black sea, set against a dark blue sky. Amid the rocks are slabs and panels of walls and doorways that seem to indicate habitation, but their contiguous setting and relief against the rock face itself implies that they are only affectations of life and human intention. That the isle itself is some labyrinthine mass, the home only of shadows and spirits. The center of the island is dominated by a seemingly impenetrable wall of cypress trees, depicted in such dark coloring and looming at such great height over the scene that they suggest their own guardian's sentience. The mass of rock forms a water gate, and at the mouth of this gate is a small boat being rowed by what appears to be either a woman or a man with long hair. Standing in the middle of the boat is a figure clad all in white, perhaps a representation of Charon, the ferryman to the land of the dead in Greek mythology. Or perhaps it's only a sculpture. Also on the boat is a cargo, a rectangular box that seems to be covered in a white sheet matching the robing or relief of the standing figure. Is this a coffin? We don't know. What is most interesting about the painting, however, is that despite all its motifs seeming to connote death, the passing of life into the hollow void of the beyond, the boat, being paddled by the human figure, actually seems to be going away from the island, out into the Black Sea, its destination unknown. Böcklin's iconic painting would prove to have an indelible impact on the fertile imagination of the young Val, a young man who was already a host of contradictions. Insubordinate and difficult to manage without being overly confrontational, self-driven while being inwardly drawn, and beset by all kinds of fears that, at the same time, he liked to play with and explore. Böcklin's painting would appear prominently in the scene decoration of his 1943 film I Walked with a Zombie, a story all about the thin line between life and death, between symbolism and reality, and taking place itself on a small, sepulchral island, no less. We, of course, talked about I Walked with a Zombie on episode 18 of this season. The painting would even directly inspire an entire film of his, 1945's Isle of the Dead, starring Boris Karloff. Being as well-read as he was at his early age, being as fascinated with history and mythology, it is doubtful that the signification of Böcklin's symbolism was lost on Lewton. But one wonders if the painting left such a brand upon his brain because of the unique ways in which they called out to his own latent traumas and anxieties. Was this Isle of the Dead not like Yalta, the Mediterranean paradise where Lewton was born, now shrunken and faded into bleak memory? Could the waters contained by the Isle's gate represent anything short of the Black Sea itself? Was that perhaps his mother or himself paddling away from the crumbling world of the past with only a sliver of hope for sanctuary? And who exactly is this figure who stands at the stern of the boat, faced imperiously towards the past? And what is this ominous cargo that the Levintons carried with them? Young Val's temperament eventually became so difficult to manage that Nina and Alla finally decided to send him to a private boarding school in New Rochelle, but he was soon expelled. He was subsequently enrolled in the Classen Point Military Academy, but according to his sister's memoirs, what meager discipline he received at the school was ultimately balanced out by the uncouth habits he picked up by hanging around with, quote, a lot of Irish tough boys. By 1913, having moved with his mother and sister to an apartment in Manhattan after the marriage of his Aunt Alla to another actor named Charles Bryant, Val was back at public school, where his pattern of disciplinary troubles, truancy, and picking up bad habits from other boys only compounded. At Charles's behest, the Lewtons tried military school again in 1916, this time the New York Military Academy. Despite poor academic achievements, some modicum of discipline finally seemed to take hold with the 13-year-old Val even being made a cadet captain. But no sooner did summer let out and Val returned to the cottage at Hooterok and he was back to being a nuisance. Well into his teenage years, and despite every opportunity, Val seemed to have absolutely no talent for even basic social graces, much less a basic social filter. At the age of 16, he got fired from his first real job working as an elevator operator at a department store, but was fired when he jokingly told the owner's wife, "Sorry, madam, this elevator takes only one person." In the meantime, which is to say, in the meantime of not doing anything constructive about his future, Val had taken to writing verse, handing out copies of his poems in Portchester Square, and giving both public and private readings of them, many uninvited. In another of his eccentric and feudal gestures, he even wrote his poems under a pseudonym, even though everybody knew who he was. He got another crack at a steady job when he was made a society reporter at the Darien Stamford Review, but he was fired when his editor discovered that he had fabricated a story. Amazingly, though, Val seemed to have been bitten by the journalism bug. It was at least a career in writing, which Val loved to do, and so he decided to enroll in Columbia University's School of Journalism. Nonetheless, he dropped out of Columbia, viewing the entire experience later as, quote, a waste of time. In 1923, just before turning 20, he saw the small press publication of his first book of verses, Panther Skin and Grapes. He continued to try to find temporary work at several newspapers, but was fired from each job he got because, he was terrible at journalism. It took a fellow journalist and personal friend, Donald Henderson Clark, taking him aside to convince Val that he should stop beating around the bush and pursue fiction writing full time. And once he did, though his success was far from immediate, things finally started to turn around for young Mr. Luton. The distracted, unruly, and impractical boy seemed to have been replaced overnight by a man of incredible discipline when it came to doing something he loved. He produced copious amounts of material, submitting verses and fiction as well as non-fiction articles, which ended up getting published in such periodicals as diverse as Cosmopolitan, Adventure, Biography, The New York Magazine, and Weird Tales. His first two novels, The Improved Road and The Cossack Sword, saw their small press publication in the United Kingdom in 1924 and 1926, respectively. Despite his wealthy background and his cultured education, what must be noted is that Val was far from an elitist. Perhaps informed by his awareness of his mother's struggle to get them to America, the hindrance of the father and the impotence of the uncle he never knew intimately, and the fact that he was raised in a household governed by two strong and independent women, he knew enough to know that nothing in the world came for free, and it seldom came to those who were the worthiest of it. For all of his opportunities, he was also only brought into this world by virtue of his mother being an attaché for her sister. His mother, having been forced to defer her own dreams to become a homemaker and then later to support the children by the skin of her teeth, had insisted that Val also learn the basics of fending for himself, of living without being served. Val was certainly privileged, there's no denying that. Disciplined cases like him rarely last as long as he did in the real world without a substantial bit of help and second chances that money can buy. But in his frame of mind, he was caught somewhere between a petulant rich boy and a hard-scrabble, foul-mouthed Irish tough street kid. It's clear that he found very little to identify or worthy of being aspired to in wealth in and of itself. Indeed, it's even safe to say that he despised pretense of all kinds. He had certainly gotten enough of it throughout his troubled early years, but it especially came to the fore when he fell in love. Val had first met his future wife, Ruth Knapp, when they were still teenagers. A romance had blossomed between the two of them, and Val would write frequently to Ruth while he was boarding at New York Military Academy. This affair did not sit well with Ruth's parents, who were from one of the richest families in Portchester. Ruth was already being courted by the son of one of Portchester's other wealthiest families, the Birdsalls, and her parents were not content to see Val interfere with that. By then, Val's reputation for eccentricity and his inability to conform to proper society preceded him. But there is little doubt that there were other factors weighed against him in the minds of the Knapps and Birdsalls of Portchester. There was also the stain of foreignness to his family, that his mother, his sister, and he were refugees whose place in American high life had to be sponsored, but who did not really belong there, so to speak. Indeed, that sponsorship into wealthy American society had only come about through nothing short of an entertainment industry that was wanton with decadence and vice, Alla's own public reputation and rumors about her sexuality likely preceding her as well. For his part, Val made little effort to disguise the fact that he derided the Knapps and their pretenses right back. Even when Val finally started to settle down and he and Ruth were finally ready to be married in the late 20s, her parents threatened to disown her. Ruth was adamant about sticking with Val, and her parents cut off virtually all ties with her. A regular, real-life Mr. and Mrs. Micawber they were. If Val only had an oppositional defiance to any kind of authority when he was just a boy, his growth into manhood also came with a deeper sense of conviction that the elites of American society were a gaggle of prejudiced, ignorant hypocrites who wouldn't know real talent or potential if it spat in their faces, much less real culture or art. Even a relationship with their own daughter was worthy of sacrifice in order to maintain a veil of purity. Not only Val's disposition, but his very nature was perceived by them as somehow corrupting and dirty. They saw his love for Ruth as sullying her, as ruining her in their eyes. They were proud merely because they had what others couldn't afford, which in their minds must have been because they were better people. And Val could plainly see that they'd done nothing to deserve their lot in life, and that there was nothing about them personally to justify it either. Val's derision for Pretense is reflected in the types of fiction to which he chose to cater his writing career. Foreshadowing his later career as a film producer, Val tended to find his niche as a writer in a variety of genres, though mostly in those small press, low quality paperbacks that we call pulp fiction. It wasn't just that Val himself, a voracious reader, recognized that very many good writers were unfairly maligned due to their associations with the lurid and the vulgar. It was that he himself found a stimulating challenge in trying to take a novel that was packaged as one thing and elevate it into something else for the reader. The true challenge, he reckoned, was to blur the line between high and low culture, between fine prose and sensational subject, to get rid of pretense altogether in order to provide a captivating experience that was at once visceral and intellectually motivated, accessible and legible to people of all walks of life. Let's go ahead and cycle back to 1916 for a second. Having already been a highly successful stage presence, Alla had broken into motion pictures by signing a contract with Metro Studios. Commanding considerable power and influence in the industry almost immediately, heedless of any social stigma against her lifestyle or any sexist stereotypes, she maintained a nearly unprecedented involvement in the creation of her films, including acting as a writer, producer, and even co-director of her 1918 film Eye for Eye. She made a number of well-received films for the studio, and by 1920, she was earning $13,000 a week from Metro, the highest-paid film performer of her time. Way back when she had gotten the contract, she also saw to it that her sister, Nina, got a job in the story department of Metro's New York offices. After the publication of Val's second book, The Cossack Sword, Metro Pictures, by now having merged with Goldwyn Pictures and Louis B. Mayer Productions to form Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, Nina, in turn, got her son a job in the New York's office's publicity department. Working under Howard Dietz, Val also received considerable tutelage from his mother and soon excelled as an all-purpose employee. He was eventually put in charge of the serialization and radio department under Dietz, and in this capacity was responsible for turning out 50,000 words of serialization a week, as well as a radio dramatization for every other film produced by MGM. With a secure publicity job and still writing novels on the side, Val married Ruth at St. John's Church on Perry Street on April 19, 1929. They were too broke for a honeymoon, and so they just moved into an apartment in Greenwich Village without ceremony. Val and Ruth's first daughter, Ruth Nina, was born on May 7, 1930. The delivery was complicated for both mother and child, Ruth nearly losing her life during the birth, and Val being forced to give his new daughter a direct blood transfusion to keep her alive. With the economic strain of a flatlining economy and a new child, the Lutens moved into an even smaller apartment in Rye, and Val worked harder than ever to make money in both his publicity job as well as in freelance writing. Co-writing with an old Columbia University friend named Herbert Kirkall, Val saw the publication of his third novel, The Fateful Star Murder, through the small publisher Mohawk Press in 1931. This would be Val's first novel published in the United States, and an official U.S. publication of his second novel, The Cossack Sword, under the more lurid title Rape of Glory, was released by Mohawk in the same year. In the early part of 1932, the Macaulay Publishing Company published his fourth novel, When the Cobra Sings. His penetration of the literary mainstream was still spotty at best, but it would be with Luton's fifth novel that he saw his fortunes finally begin to turn around. His first novel to be printed by a major American publishing house, the Vanguard Press, No Bed of Her Own, was packaged as a sensational, salacious social problem story about the evils of sex work and the criminal underworld. But the novel was, in fact, the culmination of Luton's now seasoned pattern of being able to take his marginalization into racy pulp genres and, nonetheless, through efficient but effective prose, largely naturalistic but punctuated by poetic crescendos, conveying to his reader a melancholic attention to dramatic detail. Originally serialized in the Mirror magazine, No Bed of Her Own is set in 1929. It is the story of an independent young secretary named Rose, whose insolence towards her middle managers gets her sacked just as the stock market crashes. The plot of the story then deals with her hardscrabble experiences as she is forced into hunger, desperation, and ultimately, or at least implicitly, sexual exploitation. Recurring themes of the novel include the abdication of men from relationships in times of crisis, something that Val no doubt had a lot of intimate experience with as a young child, gender imbalances magnified by poverty, ditto, sex work, and the trauma of survivor's guilt among those who managed to survive the Great Depression. No Bed of Her Own was an overnight success and was even adapted into a sanitized radio serial format by the Heckscher Flower Corporation. Paramount Pictures purchased the film adaptation rights to the novel despite the dubious possibility of a work with such liberal sexual politics and such explicit and non-judgmental treatment of prostitution ever making it to the silver screen. At first, Paramount executives decided to simply throw out Luton's story and retain the title for its sensational draw, only to change even that when the Hays office objected to the association at all. The resulting film starring Clark Gable and Carole Lombard was finally released at the end of 1932 as No Man of Her Own, bearing no relationship to Luton's original novel. Still, the success of the book convinced him to quit his day job at MGM's New York offices to take another stab at being a full-time fiction writer. The success of the novel had scored Luton a deal with Vanguard for the delivery of 4 more novels within the year, and through this book deal he was able to move Ruth and the baby Nina out of their small Rye apartment and buy a house in the shoreside neighborhood of Coscob in Greenwich, Connecticut. He also bought a sailboat and adopted the pattern of sailing his boat, docking in a far-off harbor, finding a cheap motel room, and ruthlessly writing well into the night. By the end of 1933, he had both fulfilled his contract with Vanguard and completed a thrice-weekly radio serial called The Luck of Joan Christopher. Still, greater success failed to materialize. Luton's mother, Nina, was by now an 18-year veteran at MGM's New York offices, having climbed up the rungs to being the manager of the story department. When the request came through from California that David O. Selznick, the studio's vice president in charge of production, was looking for writers of Russian extraction to pen a treatment for an adaptation of Nikolai Gogol's historical novella Taras Bulba, Nina quickly prepared a list of 5 writers, but was also sure to recommend her own son. When none of the other 5 writers showed interest in the project, Selznick took a chance on this unassuming former publicity man, offering him a weekly rate of $200 to produce a treatment for the project. Thus, in the summer of 1934, Val made plans to sell his home in Coscob and moved into a rented house in the Pacific Palisades neighborhood of Los Angeles. Luton was hopeful that the completion of the treatment would spark new offers, but upon fulfilling his contract, he was informed that his services were no longer needed, and the project itself was shelved. Val, Ruth, and little Nina were now stranded in Los Angeles with few connections and fewer prospects. Not long after, though, Luton got the call from Selznick. The producer had been dissatisfied with Val's treatment, but he had appreciated his strident work ethic, his literate nature, his faithfulness to the source material, and his rigorous attention to period-accurate details. In other words, he had found something of a kindred spirit. Thus, Selznick instead offered Luton a job as his personal secretary and assistant at $75 a week. Luton accepted. As Selznick's assistant, Luton's duties encompassed everything from quoting Joel E. Siegel's 1973 book Val Luton, The Reality of Terror, advising on properties and the selection of actors, patching up rough places in screenplays, and checking production designs and set dressings for historical authenticity. Furthermore, as the development on Selznick's overlapping prestige literary adaptations soldiered on, Luton revealed a remarkable ability to curry the favor of Joseph Breen, the chief censor of the Production Code Administration. Acting as Selznick's go-between, Luton was able to persuade Breen to accept aspects of a film's plot or themes that he would not otherwise tolerate. This personal rapport that Luton developed with Breen had an added benefit, though. See, Luton didn't just argue or debate with the censors like most filmmakers tried to do. He got Breen talking, and it turned out when you got Breen talking, he was liable to give you the scoop on story materials and projects being developed by rival studios. Luton was not only essential to Selznick's ensuring that his literary adaptations would be seen as definitive cinematic versions of these classic works for decades to come, he also ensured that, as an executive, Selznick could stay ahead of the competition. At first, Luton could take pride in being the unsung support behind the more visible Selznick successes with Anna Karenina and A Tale of Two Cities, both of which were released towards the end of 1935 to critical acclaim and tremendous box office. At the very least, with A Tale of Two Cities, Luton could also see his name in the credits. In a rare move that gave his assistant the greater responsibility and a pathway to better things that he desired, Selznick had hired Luton as a producer on the film's second unit, overseeing French émigré Jacques Tourneur's direction of the adaptation's highly complex and dynamic revolutionary sequences. But as a frequent story editor who made significant story contributions along every step of the way for both productions, Luton couldn't help but feeling that he was not receiving the acknowledgement, much less the credit, that he deserved. When Selznick decided to leave MGM to form his own production company, Selznick International Pictures, or SIP, Luton went with him, becoming the fledgling Independent's chief story editor for its West Coast offices. But without a pay raise and with a boss who felt that Luton was too valuable in his current capacity to be given the types of hands-on opportunities that would inevitably draw him away from Selznick's orbit, Luton's feelings about being underappreciated were magnified when Selznick's favor began to be distracted by the story editor of SIP's East Coast offices, 1K Brown. Brown and Luton's dispositions couldn't have been more different. He was an artistic idealist, someone whose appreciation for subtlety over sensation once made him a favorable influence in Selznick's universe. Brown was more practical and gravitated more to classic prestige picture showmanship. Furthermore, her tastes in literature were more inclined to what was currently in vogue among most of the American public. Which is to say, her fingers were closer to the pulse of what would make for a popular adaptation, not just what she thought was a good work to adapt. It would be Brown who recommended Margaret Mitchell's 1936 novel Gone with the Wind for a possible film adaptation. Luton, on the other hand, had read and hated Mitchell's novel. He found it at once garishly over-the-top and shallow, a far cry from the more tactful classics that Selznick had adapted in their MGM days. He much preferred Rebecca, Daphne du Maurier's Gothic novel, the adaptation of which SIP was simultaneously fighting with the Production Code Administration to get off the ground, Selznick's contract talent Alfred Hitchcock set to direct it. While both productions would go into effect with the full force of Selznick's efforts, and together with their critical acclaim and box office success stand as perhaps the definitive moment of his cinematic legacy, it would be the melodramatically decadent Gone with the Wind, not the stark and lyrical Rebecca, which would prove to be Selznick's top-line production. It was another silent message to Luton that his days of being the pearl of Selznick's eye were over. He was now just another asset, and after 6 years of commitment, he'd seen no considerable advancement in his career to show for it. SIP would net $10 million in profits in the fiscal year 1940 from Gone with the Wind and Rebecca. But in a tale as old as time when it comes to prestige Hollywood, Selznick's independent venture was a victim of its own success. Having produced the films virtually back-to-back, Selznick was completely exhausted and in need of an indefinite hiatus from filmmaking. Furthermore, SIP itself lacked both the facilities and the kind of robust production program to properly amortize, reinvest, and defray the profits of their hit films. So, even though its productions were quite successful, the company was paying for it all on the back end in terms of taxes. In August of 1940, SIP's investors, with Selznick's consent, decided to dissolve the company altogether over a period of 3 years, intent on having their profits taxed as capital gains rather than the higher rates of corporate or personal income. Shortly after SIP went under, Selznick established David O. Selznick Productions, where Luton could still maintain his secretary and assistant job. But despite its name, this new company acted primarily as a rental service, which is to say, a company that was not so much a production company as it was a talent agency that Selznick used to take all the actors and technicians and directors who were currently under contract for him, and then they would package productions to be sold to other studios for them to produce and distribute. In other words, rather than his efforts moving him forward in his career, Lewton was now even farther from the intimate involvement in film production that he had 6 years before. With a second child added to the mix, Val Edwin Lewton having been born on May 23, 1937, no raise in income and no upward mobility, the senior Lewton, now 36, was facing a professional and personal crisis. Born on May 6, 1915 in Kenosha, Wisconsin, George Orson Welles would not necessarily go on to have an entirely blissful career himself. But it could still be said that he would enjoy a kind of critical and international acclaim throughout his years that Val Lewton could only achieve decades after his untimely death. Still, it can also be said that there are some uncanny parallels between the lives of the two auteurs, which only gives the intersection of their careers the respective tales of rise and fall, and even more poetic tenor, one that both filmmakers would have no doubt appreciated. Though Val was 10 years Orson's senior, their birthdays were literally only a day apart. They both came from privileged backgrounds in which they received an exceptional level of both cultural and industrious education, except that, as opposed to the new immigrant Lewton, Welles's family line stretched back to the early English stock that first came to North America aboard the Mayflower. Like Lewton, Welles demonstrated an exceptional and prodigious knack for classic literature and the fine arts from a very early age, disproportionately cultivated by his mother, Beatrice Ives. They shared a streak for performative eccentricity, as well as strange neuroses and difficulty in adjusting to formal education and adhering to conventional authority and social graces. Though Welles, unlike Lewton, knew his father, they were alike in the fact that they were born into tempestuous marriages that began to unravel in their early years. Like Lewton's father, Maximilian, Richard Hodgson Welles was given to drink and philandry, and his progressive alcoholism proved to be the virtual ruin of his wife. Encouraged by her friends and her own lover, Beatrice, adept at classical piano, broke into the Musical Society of Chicago, leaving her husband and taking young Orson with her. So, just like with Lewton, we have a pattern of the abdication of a male guardian, as well as the prospective solution being found by an independent mother in transplanting the family to a major city, with the arts as a source of income and stability. Val's situation significantly improved at that little farm in Portchester, whereas Orson's situation was a bit more complicated. His mother passed away in 1924 from hepatitis. Only 6 years later, he had lost his father as well. In the summer of 1931, at only 16 years of age, Orson decided to head for Dublin to start in the theatre anew. Maybe it's a stretch, but I find it interesting that whereas Orson would finally start to see the beginnings of his individual success in the Irish theater, Val's first 2 novels were printed by an Irish publishing house. From there, however, the path of Val and Orson's stars could not have been more different. Lewton spent the 30s struggling to balance his passion for creative writing with an incredibly demanding publicity job, only to become the ignominious apprentice of a Hollywood mogul who never gave him the credit, the pay, or the opportunity he really wanted. Both young men took on workloads and schedules that would have bordered on masochism for most ordinary people. In Welles's case, though, he rapidly excelled as a star of not only the American theater, but also the medium of radio, as not only an actor, but also as writer, producer, and director. Hence, it's unsurprising that the major studios of Hollywood had already been courting the wunderkind to make an official transition to the motion pictures. But Welles consistently refused offers for 2 primary reasons. For one, he did not want to give up the kind of creative control he could wield on the stage and on the airwaves. For another, the majors seemed to have a habit of offering him fare that was too light for his taste, or, quite the opposite, giving him the deep-voiced, imposing dramatist material that, while tempting, would threaten to typecast him as a horror star. Such was the case when George J. Schaefer, the president of RKO Radio Pictures, offered Welles the opportunity to spearhead a fresh, prestigious adaptation of either The Hunchback of Notre Dame or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Backed by RCA manager David Sarnoff and RKO's major stockholders, Schaefer had come over from United Artists in October 1938, inaugurating his studio regime with a simple but, in retrospect, terrifyingly ambitious slogan: quality pictures at a premium price. With a clear eye towards emulating Selznick's brief but positive legacy, Schaefer was undeterred by RKO's pattern of excess, extravagance, and lingering financial instability. You had to spend money to make money, he reasoned, and for RKO to get to the financial and public relations level that it needed in order to survive, well, then they would have to spend a whole lot of money to make a whole lot of money. I've talked previously about this strange, lingering affinity in Depression-era Hollywood for models of profit-making that seemed heavily predicated on prestige pictures despite an obvious pattern of such prestige-focused models, as was the case for Universal under the Laemmles and would be the case for RKO under Schaefer, to lead to extravagance, inefficiency, and ultimately severe financial crisis. I've suggested several factors that might contextualize this financial model as being more sensible sounding at the time than it does in retrospect. Remember, theater attendance is on the decline during this period, and costs of production are only going way up anyway. As far as RKO's stockholders were concerned, despite their previous spotty history with the prestige-focused model, these combined factors alone made progressive investment in the long-term earning power of bigger-budget, higher-profile, more extravagant films only more salient than more cost controls, which themselves did not necessarily provide a greater guarantee of dragging the studio out of the red. And quite frankly, this is a pattern that we would see repeat itself throughout film history and well into the present day. But I'm going to go ahead and suggest another factor of a more personal, pathological kind, particularly as it regards the ill-fated Laemmles at Universal and George J. Schaefer at RKO. Maybe part of the reason prestige pictures and blockbusters loom so large as both the cause of and solution to all of Hollywood's problems is a simple combination of vanity and sunken cost fallacy. With an old guard and a more meat-and-potatoes movie mogul on its way out and a new generation of aspirational auteurs on their way in, it's possible that certain directors, producers, and even executives and financiers of the motion pictures simply developed a possessive investment in prestige pictures that went beyond their economic success. With a more sophisticated culture of film criticism and even an official industry awards system developed around film production, increasingly isolated to a single geographic location, the social incentives for being able to compete not only for successful products, but for respected ones was all the more demanding. And if you've already sunk $500,000, $1 million, $2 million of the studio's coffers into a lost gamble, well, why not go for broke? Why not go all in? At the time that he was courting Welles to get behind a new prestige horror picture, Schaefer had good reason to feel that the star of stage and radio would be the safest bet imaginable, that RKO's exclusive association with this boy wonder was just their ticket to not only financial stability, but cultural respectability as a producer and distributor of not merely extravagant, but rather artful motion pictures, respectable motion pictures. Welles, as we've already said, wasn't too keen on being pigeonholed into being a new Lon Chaney. Schaefer did, however, offer him something that few studio executives were willing to offer, which was complete creative control over his productions. Hence, Schaefer was finally able to sign Welles, along with the entire Mercury Theater Players group around him, to an exclusive contract for RKO on July 22, 1939. Now, Wells didn't precisely have carte blanche when it came to his RKO deal. The studio still reserved the right to change his films if they could not satisfy the Production Code Administration, and he was specifically bound on admittedly vague grounds from making works that were, quote, political or controversial. The point about controversy, even avoiding the retrospective angle, seems to have been a foolish formality indeed. Why would you hire the man behind Voodoo Macbeth and the mass panic-inducing radio adaptation of The War of the Worlds if you wanted to avoid controversy? Still, Wells was now breaking into the film industry with a level of creative control that had been unprecedented since the heyday of Charlie Chaplin, and he was going to leverage that freedom for all it was worth. Within a year, however, the short-sightedness of Schaefer's gamble on the 24-year-old star started to show. Though Wells was bound exclusively to RKO as a film producer, his contract did not bind him to focus his attentions exclusively on film production. He was still dealing with the Mercury Theater's heavy rotation of radio programs for which he would serve as key producer, director, writer, often star, and almost always announcer and introducer. To give the young, unmanageable upstart some credit, it couldn't be helped if RKO at first saw it as a sound investment to recruit such a noted perfectionist and iconoclast, and to then be so fastidious about restraining him from making political or controversial subjects. It would hence be a full year before he was able to settle on a project that he was allowed to pursue with creative independence while nominally satisfying RKO's executives and stockholders. This project would, unfortunately for RKO, be Citizen Kane, which would finally see its limited release in May of 1941. With a hefty price tag of almost $840,000, Citizen Kane was already dead on arrival as far as RKO's ability to recoup its investment. With its central tragic character clearly modeled on the real-life media baron William Randolph Hearst, the project's very release saw immediate obstacles from not only Hearst's clandestine efforts to shut down the film's production, but also from an entire industry that did not want to provoke the sleeping dragon of one of the most powerful voices in American communications and business. An MGM representative was even sent to offer Schaefer the princely sum of $842,000 to effectively write off the project, in exchange for destroying not only all the prints of the film, but also the original camera negatives. Luella Parsons, a gossip columnist and personal spokesperson for Hearst, had phoned Sarnoff and RKO's majority stockholder, Nelson Rockefeller, and threatened them with muckraking coverage of their professional and personal lives if the film was released. The threat of the latter led to the untimely cancellation of the film's originally scheduled premiere at the Rockefeller-owned Radio City Music Hall in New York City. Not simply content to restrict the film's premiere, Hearst had made it known that he would refuse to run ads in his newspapers for any theater palace or theater chain that showed the film. Schaefer himself, in turn, was forced to threaten the major theater owners, Warner Brothers, Fox, Paramount, and Loews, who owned MGM, with a conspiracy lawsuit. Even still, in many cases, the theaters simply booked prints of Citizen Kane, but never actually screened them. RKO's economic woes weren't confined to Wells's defiant satirical piece either. Hearst banned the publicity of all RKO productions from his papers. The entire Kane fiasco was enough to convince Schaefer that he was in desperate need of reining in Wells's seemingly impervious ego. With the advent of America's involvement in the Second World War, Schaefer pushed Wells to choose a less ambitious and more topical subject for his next production, that being an adaptation of Eric Ambler's spy novel, Journey into Fear. Wells unofficially agreed to develop, produce, direct, and star in the picture, but only if he was first allowed to go ahead with his own adaptation of Booth Tarkington's The Magnificent Ambersons. While Wells would work for a time on both productions simultaneously, handing directing duties on Journey into Fear over to Norman Foster, it was clear that his primary investment was in The Magnificent Ambersons, as well as a fourth project, a Latin American set omnibus film called It's All True. Indeed, Wells would compel his production unit to shoot all his scenes for Journey into Fear in just 24 hours so that he could quickly hop on a plane for Rio de Janeiro to begin principal photography on It's All True. Thus, the task of editing the reams of takes done for The Magnificent Ambersons largely fell to editor Robert Wise and his assistant, Mark Robeson, an ordeal made all the more excruciating because Welles had to either phone in or wire all of his instructions, which remained perfectionist and demanding despite his physical absence. 2 separate test screenings of 2 separate cuts of The Magnificent Ambersons approved by Welles yielded equally disastrous results, and RKO executives had finally had enough. They ordered hasty reshoots on The Magnificent Ambersons from late April to early May of 1942, forcing Robert Wise to work around the clock to not only direct these new sequences, but to also cobble them together in the editing room. The final studio cut, well short of Welles's original 2.5-hour melodramatic epic, was a modest 88 minutes. All in all, those 88 minutes had cost the studio $1.1 million. $1.1 million for 80 minutes of movie. That's $12,500 per minute. With zero faith in the product, RKO ended up dumping The Magnificent Ambersons onto the lower half of a double feature bill with the Lupe Velez vehicle Mexican Spitfire Sees a Ghost in the summer of 1942. By the following year, the film had managed only $1 million in rentals, netting the studio at least $500,000 in net losses. Schaefer resigned from RKO in disgrace shortly before the film saw its release, and Rockefeller, the primary booker of It's All True, would leave its board of directors shortly after. With Schaefer and Rockefeller now out of the picture, RKO decided to shut down production on It's All True, not content to sink any more money into Welles's failed passion projects. All in all, the 3 productions combined drained the studio of $2 million. Charles Kerner, formerly a vice president in charge of RKO's theaters, took over as general manager of the studio. In stark contrast to Schaefer's slogan of quality pictures at a premium price, Kerner immediately commissioned a new memo to be distributed to studio staff and stockholders proclaiming a new motto: showmanship in place of genius. As a subtitle to this motto, Kerner even came up with a flourish to evoke the can-do spirit of Franklin Roosevelt's presidency: a New Deal at RKO. Unlike the New Deal, however, the radical changes that Kerner would attempt to inaugurate at RKO would not involve like an expansion of the studio's payroll or something. Certainly not. In addition to the immediate firing of Welles and all his Mercury Theater troupe, many other contract employees were either fired, compelled to resign, or resigned of their own volition. Some technicians and creative staff, such as Robert Wise and Mark Robeson, regardless of whether or not that they were ever officially a part of Welles's inner circle, became tainted by association and were thus effectively demoted to the studio's B picture unit, now being overseen by a freshly hired superintendent named Lou Ostro. Beyond simple belt-tightening measures, refocusing some of RKO's investment strategy away from prestige pictures to instead focus on low- and mid-budget programmers, Kerner's express interest was also to completely reshape the studio's production process. Ironically, Kerner's approach was actually more in line with David O. Selznick's brief tenure at the studio than Schaefer's was. In hiring Lou Ostro, Kerner demonstrated a keen interest in combining aspects of Selznick's unit production system with elements of the classical, centralized production model. Selznick's period at the studio had demonstrated both the possibilities for both public response at both a critical and financial level, as well as the financial efficiency of a production model in which producers and directors had significant creative control, with a specific producer acting as a unit head, reporting directly to a single executive rather than working through an overly bureaucratic channel. Schaefer's disastrous regime and his inability to corral the unruly Orson Welles, however, had illustrated the severe limitations of the unit production system in which the motivations of the unit producer and the executive were not in adequate symmetry, or, more bluntly, when the executive was not willing or able to exercise centralized dictatorial control over what unit producers were allowed to do. Furthermore, it likely seemed to Kerner that the unit production model had more potential when applied to a studio's programmers than it did when applied to its leading top bill investments. It was a steady supply of cheap pictures that could soundly and quickly pad out the studio's books that RKO so desperately needed, and a unit production system, it seemed, was just the thing to ensure that they got cranked out as quickly and efficiently as possible. In particular, Kerner thought there was one genre that RKO had simply failed to capitalize upon effectively: the horror picture. During the 30s, RKO had mainly stayed clear of spectacles that were weird and frightening, though King Kong, covered in Season 2, Episode 17 of this podcast, had represented one of the most enduringly popular and financially successful hits of the studio. When the passage of the H certificate by the British Board of Film Censors effectively banned the horror film in the UK and thus foreclosed at least 40% of the foreign box office for American horror flicks, RKO had joined the rest of the majors in winding down the Golden Age horror cycle after 1936. Suddenly, however, at the exact same time that Schafer was finalizing a deal with Orson Welles, RKO had been caught flat-footed when horror was finally coming back into vogue. Universal was once again leading the pack with successful re-releases of Frankenstein and Dracula, and certified hits such as Son of Frankenstein in 1939, The Invisible Man Returns in 1940, and, most promisingly of all, the relatively low-budget The Wolfman in 1941. We covered Son of Frankenstein on episode 5 of this season and The Wolfman on episode 6. But it wasn't just the House of Horror either. Other studios were making far more earnest overtures at getting in on the ground floor of a new horror boom than they were during the 1930s. Warner Brothers had thrown together a belated sequel, The Return of Dr. X. Paramount had released a critically and financially successful new adaptation of The Cat and the Canary, as well as King Kong creator Marion C. Cooper's latest special effects extravaganza, Dr. Cyclops. MGM had scored a hit with their prestigious new adaptation of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in August of 1941. For the past 3 years, Harry Cohn had been running circles around the B-horror competition with a series of quite popular Mad Doctor films starring Boris Karloff, and likely seeing exactly what Kerner was seeing, William Goetz, the interim president of 20th Century Fox, was fast-tracking 2 of his own horror flicks into production. The horror genre wasn't a one-studio game anymore, as it had been in the Golden Age. Even as theater attendances were dipping, it was about to tick up during the war years, and there was even then an evident and growing appetite among the American public on the eve of war, ironically, for stories of the grim, macabre, and grotesque. And one would be a fool to not give the audience, bless 'em, exactly what they wanted. It's not clear how Kerner first discovered the mistreated young clerk who would eventually be the producer of his fresh new horror unit, though it's possible he was given a tip by one Joseph Breen. Though chief censor of the Production Code Administration, Breen had temporarily stepped in to be RKO's president after it was still reeling from the Welles fiasco and Schafer's resignation. It may very well have been Breen who recalled to Kerner a literate, amicable, and, above all, non-combative young man who was currently stuck at a job he hated as a glorified secretary over at David O. Selznick's agency, and was looking to become a producer. Kerner eventually got in touch with that unassuming young assistant. In March of 1942, turning 38 years old in just 2 months, Val Lewton quit his job at David O. Selznick Productions and went to work for RKO. That'll bring us to the end of part 2. Please join us again on Monster Craze Memoirs for the finale of this supplemental trilogy, as we chart the brief success of Val Lewton as RKO's chief horror man, as well as his untimely fall from grace in The Smaller They Are, the Harder They Fall. Stay tuned.